Hi guys, we're going to pick up from where the applied practice quiz left off. The door of the jail being flung open from within, there appeared, in the first place, like a black shadow emerging into sunshine, the grim and grisly presence of the town beadle, with a sword by his side and his staff of office in his hand. All right, so first we notice here, we're going to do both literary devices and also content thoughts that we have while we're reading. So we see here a simile. My handwriting is not going to be amazing on this, so please forgive me. We also have here the town beadle. So we have a character introduced who's new to us. And so it says, with a sword by his side and his staff of office in his hand. So here we have this characterization of the beadle. So we could write DC for direct characterization, where he's being described the way that he looks. This personage prefigured and represented in his aspect the whole dismal severity of the Puritanic code of law, which, so here we have a symbol. So he is representative of the dismal code of Puritanic law, right? So here we see that he is going to probably be an important symbol for that. And we'll see how the way he looks and how he's described, how that connects to him representing the severity of the Puritanic code of law, which it was his business to administer in its final and closest application to the offender. Stretching forth the official staff in his left hand, he laid his right upon the shoulder of a young woman, whom he thus drew forward, until on the threshold of the prison door, she repelled him by an action marked with natural dignity and force of character, and stepped into the open air as if by her own free will. So that's interesting. So this part, we're seeing that he is walking with her, right, taking her, but she actually doesn't want that. She goes of her own free will. And so that's going to be interesting if you think about the beadle as a symbol representing the Puritanic code that clearly Hester has broken. She, steps aside from him. So that seems significant. She bore in her arms a child, a baby of some 3 months old, who winked and turned aside its little face from the too vivid light of day, because its existence, heretofore, had brought it acquainted only with the gray twilight of a dungeon or other darksome apartment of the prison. So this is Pearl, and we see that Pearl is used to darkness because she, of course, has been in jail and is not aware of the sunlight. So we again see that sunlight's going to be important as it relates to Pearl. Okay. Next page. When the young woman, the mother of this child, stood fully revealed before the crowd, it seemed to be her first impulse to clasp the infant closely to her bosom. So she's holding Pearl tightly, not so much by an impulse of motherly affection as that she might thereby conceal a certain token which was wrought or fastened into her dress. So there we see mention of the scarlet A. Remember, the A is on her physical clothing. She's holding Pearl tightly, probably out of fear. This is a scary experience to be standing in front of everybody. Also, remember the connection between Pearl and the scarlet letter itself. Both of those are symbols of Hester's sin. Okay. In a moment, however, wisely judging that one token of her shame would but poorly serve to hide another, she took the baby on her arm, and with a burning blush and yet a haughty smile, and a glance that would not be abashed, looked around at her townspeople and neighbors. So there we have kind of what I was just talking about, which is both are symbolic, both Pearl and the A that's on her chest are symbolic of the love she, of course, had for Dimmesdale, which we know the plot, so no spoilers here. And also, of course, the fact that in the eyes of her Puritanic society, she wasn't allowed to love him. She wasn't allowed to feel the way that she felt. And of course, now she's being publicly shamed. Okay, so now we'll learn more about the actual A. On the breast of her gown, in fine red cloth, surrounded with an elaborate embroidery and fantastic flourishes of gold thread, appeared the letter A. So look at how the A is described. right? So look at the description here of the A. So, I mean, obviously we're getting imagery. We're seeing how things look. And it's interesting, though, that it's embroidered in an elaborate way, and it has these fantastic flourishes of gold thread. So it's adorned very beautifully. It was so artistically done, look at that word, right? Artistically done, and with so much fertility and gorgeous luxuriance of fancy, that it had all the effect of a last and fitting decoration to the apparel which she wore, and which was of a splendor in accordance with the taste of the age, but greatly beyond what was allowed by the sumptuary regulations of the colony. So here we see the A is decorated, look at the word choice, right? Gorgeous. Again, we're seeing splendor. And so we're seeing that it's beautifully decorated and adorned. That's probably going to be important as we go throughout the novel, the way that it looks. The young woman was tall, with a figure of perfect elegance on a larger... So here, again, we're getting DC of Hester. Direct characterization of what she looks like. So notice her beauty, which is in contrast to how most of the other women so far have been described, the regular townspeople. She had dark and abundant hair, so glossy that it threw off the sunshine with a gleam, and a face which, besides being beautiful from regularity of feature and richness of complexion, had the impressiveness belonging to a marked brow and deep black eyes. She was ladylike, too, after the manner of the feminine gentility of those days, characterized by a certain state and dignity, rather than by the delicate, evanescent, and indescribable grace, which is now recognized as its indication. And never had, so again, look at these word choices, right? State and dignity, indescribable grace. Look at the diction that's being associated with Hester. She's described, again, right, the beauty. She has regularity of feature, richness of complexion, and she's obviously impressive looking, and she was also carrying herself in a ladylike way. And never had Hester Prynne appeared more ladylike. Okay, so again, main character, or one of the main four characters. And never had Hester Prynne appeared more ladylike in the antique interpretation of the term than as she issued from the prison. So that's interesting. So she's never looked more ladylike than when leaving the prison. It's kind of a contrasting observation. Those who had before known her, Those who had before known her and had expected to behold her dimmed and obscured by a disastrous cloud, and had, astonished. So they're surprised that she doesn't look, they thought she'd be all, looking down and dreary, but she doesn't. They were astonished and even startled to perceive how her beauty shone out and made a halo of the misfortune and ignominy. That's a word choice that we're going to see pops up several times. Okay, sorry, I had a small lapse there with the recording. So ignominy, this means public shame or disgrace. Public shame or disgrace. So again, that's what's happening, right? That she's been made to publicly be admonished for her sin. So interesting use of the word halo, right? A halo of the misfortune and ignominy in which she was enveloped. It may be true that to a sensitive observer, there was something exquisitely painful in it. So again, I feel bad for her. That seems like a horrible thing to have to be going through. Her attire, attire, of course, is her clothing. Her attire, which indeed she had wrought for the occasion. Remember, she sews. So she's the one who's making the clothes, and she's the one who stitched the A to look so beautiful and adorned in gold and all of that. That was Hester's doing. Her attire, which indeed she had wrought for the occasion in prison, and had modeled much after her own fancy, so what she thought was pretty, seemed to express the attitude of her spirit, the desperate recklessness of her mood, by its wild and picturesque peculiarity. But the point which drew all eyes, and as it were transfigured the wearer, so interesting, it changes the person wearing it, so that both men and women who had been familiarly acquainted with Hester Prynne were now impressed as if they beheld her for the first time, was that scarlet letter, so fantastically embroidered, again, this has been repeated, right, and illuminated upon her bosom, so right, repetition there of the way it looks. It had the effect of a spell, so not literally, of course, right? It had the effect of a spell, taking her out of the ordinary relations with humanity and enclosing her in a sphere by herself. So again, we see she's ostracized, right? And so we're seeing that that's obviously here in this chapter showing you that she's there alone. Of course, the only person with her is, in an intimate way, right, is Pearl. So here we have some dialogue, people speaking. "She hath a good skill at her needle, that's certain," remarked one of her female spectators. "But did ever a woman, before this brazen hussy, contrive such a way of showing it? Why, gossips, what is it but to laugh in the faces of our godly magistrates, and make a pride out of what they, worthy gentlemen, meant for a punishment?" So look at the word choice of, again, we're seeing the women are really harsh and they are very much scolding Hester for what she's done. And look at this word choice, right? Brazen hussy. So again, referring to a woman who has not followed the rules that they deem appropriate. Again, look at exclamation point usage there. Gossips, right? What they're calling each other, then the women who very much are gossips who've come to stare at Hester. And this is an interesting question, that they think because she's made it beautiful and adorned it as she has, that she is kind of shoving that in their face, right? That because I took the symbol that you want me to wear as my sin, I then made it beautiful. They're taking, this woman's taking issue with that. "It were well," muttered the most iron-visaged of the old dames, "if we stripped Madam Hester's rich gown off her dainty shoulders. And as for the red letter, which she hath stitched so curiously, I'll bestow a rag of mine own, again, wearing some word choice, rheumatic flannel, to make a fitter one." So here, again, we might not know what that means either. So in looking at the word choice, right, that's one thing that makes it difficult to read, is there are some word choices that we don't know. Again, though, look at the reaction. She's saying then to take off, right, we're going to strip her of her clothes. Well, that doesn't seem to be a very moral thing. So again, you're seeing the hypocrisy of these women. "Oh, peace, neighbors, peace," whispered their youngest companion. So now we have a young one in relation to these older women who are gossiping. "Do not let her hear you." So notice again, this one showing that not all of the women are these kind of horrible gossip women. "Do not let her hear you. Not a stitch in that embroidered letter, but she has felt it in her heart." Okay, so she's saying that she does know the way that she feels, right? That she knows what she's done inside her soul. The grim beadle now made a gesture with his staff. "Make way, good people, make way, in the king's name," cried he. "Open a passage, and I promise ye, Mistress Prynne shall be set where man, woman, and child may have a fair sight of her brave apparel, from this time till an hour past meridian. A blessing on the righteous colony of the Massachusetts, where iniquity is dragged out into the sunshine. Come along, Madam Hester, and show your scarlet letter in the marketplace." All right, so we're seeing this word choice, iniquity. So iniquity means immoral behavior. So again, look at the use of exclamation points, right? So let's publicly shame her. We can all publicly scorn her. And that, again, seeing that that's his role here, the beadle, is to make sure that we all see, that she has, of course, sinned, and we're going to publicly admonish her for that. A lane was forthwith opened through the crowd of spectators. Preceded by the beadle, and attended by an irregular procession of stern-browed men and unkindly visaged women, Hester Prynne set forth towards the place appointed for her punishment. A crowd of eager and curious schoolboys, understanding little of the matter in hand, except that it gave them a half-holiday, ran before her progress, turning their heads continually to stare into her face, and at the winking baby in her arms, and at the ignominious letter on her breast. So again, just seeing the adjective of the word we've already the denotation. It was no great distance in those days from the prison door to the marketplace. Measured by the prisoner's experience, however, it might be reckoned a journey of some length. For haughty as her demeanor was, she perchance underwent an agony from every footstep. So she's suffering, right? This is torture for her. From every footstep of those that thronged to see her, as if her heart had been flung into the street for them to all spurn and trample upon. So, of course, not literally, right? Simile there. Okay, moving forward, just going to go to the next page. In our nature, however, there is a provision, alike marvelous and merciful, that the sufferer should never know the intensity of what he endures by its present torture, but chiefly by the pang that rankles after it. So that's interesting, that the sufferer should never know the intensity of what they're going through right when it happens, but the pang that rankles after it. So maybe that's why, right, Hester's supposed to wear this scarlet A. It's interesting, obviously, that it's red and scarlet. It's important to notice the color imagery we see throughout the chapter. And so we are seeing here that she is going to be tortured by this throughout the rest of her life, and that's part of the point. With almost a serene deportment, therefore, Hester Prynne passed through this portion of her ordeal. So notice this is only a portion of it, right? Just a part of the suffering they want her to endure. So it's only part of the suffering. And came to a sort of scaffold at the western extremity of the marketplace. It stood nearly beneath the eaves of Boston's earliest church and appeared to be a fixture there. So she's going to a scaffold. So notice we're seeing some location setting here. And she's going to be standing on the scaffold in front of everybody, right? So they can gawk at her and admonish her. In fact, the scaffold constituted a portion of a penal machine, which now, for 2 or 3 generations past, has been merely historical and traditionary among us, but was held in the old time to be as effectual an agent in the promotion of good citizenship as ever was the guillotine among the terrorists of France. It was, in short, the platform of the pillory, and above it rose the framework of that instrument of discipline, so fashioned as to confine the human head in its tight grasp, and thus hold it up to the public gaze. Okay, so here we're seeing the role that this had as far as making sure that society was scared of this, because this platform of the pillory, right? So notice that the setting here, we have the scaffold, and then on which is the pillory. So that's with. And again, hopefully you're making annotations off of what I'm saying. I don't have a ton of room to write, so hopefully you're adding some additional notes. So here we see something interesting, which was comparing the guillotine from France, which of course the guillotine was what was used to cut your head off, right? If you were convicted or, seen doing anything wrong in France. And then that's being compared to the people being put in the pillory during Puritan time. Okay. And above it rose the framework of that instrument of discipline, so fashioned as to confine the human head in its tight grasp. So this is how it looks. If you've ever been to Colonial Williamsburg, you've probably seen this, where you put your arms in it and then your head gets in it. And so you're hunched over and it's holding your arms and head. And thus hold it up to the public gaze. The very ideal of ignominy, again, that word has been now repeated 3 times at least, was embodied and made manifest in this contrivance of wood and iron. There can be no outrage, methinks, against our common nature, whatever be the delinquencies of the individual. No outrage more flagrant than to forbid the culprit to hide his face for shame, as it was the essence of this punishment to do. So here it's almost like, we have this kind of narrator Hawthorne commentary. So we're seeing in this chapter description of Hester, description of what she looks like. We're seeing a little bit of action, right? She's being taken up onto the scaffold by the pillory. She's not going to be put in the pillory because she's holding Pearl. But so we have some actual action, but we also see commentary here, which you see in that last line. Okay, which is that the person can't hide their head. And that's one of the reasons it's so horrible, this type of punishment, because you can't escape it. Okay. In Hester Prynne's instance, however, as not unfrequently in other cases, her sentence bore that she should stand a certain time upon the platform, but without undergoing that gripe about the neck and confinement of the head. So I've already mentioned she's holding Pearl. They don't actually make her go inside with her arms and head. The proneness to which was the most devilish characteristic of this ugly engine. So that word's been used before to describe the prison, right? The ugly edifice, the ugly engine. Knowing well her part, she ascended a flight of wooden steps and was thus displayed to the surrounding multitude at about the height of a man's shoulders above the street. So I'm going to notice here this repetition of diction with the word ugly. All right, moving to the next page. Had there been a papist among the crowd of Puritans, he might have seen in this beautiful woman, so picturesque in her attire and mien, and with the infant at her bosom, an object to remind him of the image of divine maternity, which so many illustrious painters have vied with one another to represent. So here, a papist, this is a Roman Catholic, so not a Puritan. And mean, this might be a word that we don't know, which is just how somebody appears. So how they look, how they carry themselves, their manner. And this is an interesting thing to mention, that the papist, a Roman Catholic, talking about, by seeing Hester and her daughter Pearl, relating that to the image of Christ and Christ's mother. And so we'll finish this part to see what are they referencing, what is, sorry about that. So to see here the point of relating Mary and Christ to Hester and Prynne. Something which should remind him indeed, but only by contrast. Okay, so it's only by contrast that we're being reminded of that sacred image of sinless motherhood, whose infant was to redeem the world. Okay, so this again is relating to Christ and Mary. Here, there was the taint of deepest sin in the most sacred quality of human life, working such effect that the world was only the darker for this woman's beauty, and the more lost for the infant that she had borne. So that seems interesting with the contrast, that the world is only darker for her beauty and more lost because of her child. The scene was not without a mixture of awe, such as must always invest the spectacle of guilt and shame in a fellow creature before society shall have grown corrupt enough to smile instead of shuddering at it. Interesting, before society shall have grown corrupt enough to smile instead of shuddering at it. So is this foreshadowing, right? Is that what's happening here? Oops, is this a foreshadowing thing? That eventually society is going to change or not? The witnesses of Hester Prynne's disgrace had not yet passed beyond their simplicity. They were stern enough to look upon her death, had that been the sentence, without a murmur at its severity, but had none of the heartlessness of another social state, which would find only a theme for jest in an exhibition like the present. Even had there been a disposition to turn the matter into ridicule, so ridicule is something like to make fun of, it must have been repressed and overpowered by the solemn presence of men no less dignified than the governor, and several of his counselors, a judge, a general, and the ministers of the town, all of whom sat or stood in a balcony of the meeting house, looking down upon the platform. When such personages could constitute a part of the spectacle without risking the majesty or reverence of rank and office, it was safely to be inferred that the infliction of a legal sentence would have an earnest and effectual meaning. Accordingly, the crowd was somber and grave. So here, these word choices clearly setting the mood of the scene. And we're also seeing that you have a lot of important people present, right, to participate in this public scoring of Hester and her daughter. And so you see that with the men no less dignified than the governor are there along with all of these other people to participate in that, which adds to its severity, to the event being extreme. The unhappy culprit sustained herself as best a woman might, under the heavy weight of 1,000 unrelenting eyes, all fastened upon her and concentrated at her bosom. It was almost intolerable to be borne. Of an impulsive and passionate nature, she had forfeited herself to encounter the stings and venomous stabs of public contumely, wreaking itself in every variety of insult. But there was a quality so much more terrible in the solemn mood of the popular mind, that she longed rather to behold all those rigid countenances contorted with scornful merriment, and herself the object. Okay, so this means here, it was almost intolerable to be borne, but she does bear it, right? So it was almost intolerable. We probably don't have actually 1,000 unrelenting eyes. That's probably a bit of a hyperbole. We see here, though, that she is suffering. She is obviously not enjoying this experience, but more than that, she's being tortured by this experience, but she is bearing it as best that she can. So we see that here, right? She had fortified herself. And again, we have some word choice we don't know here for, like insulting language, right? Or treatment, which clearly is what's happening, every variety of insult. And solemn mood. Okay. Had a roar of laughter burst from the multitude, each man, each woman, each little shrill-voiced child contributing their individual parts, Hester Prynne might have repaid them all with a bitter and disdainful smile. But under the leaden infliction which it was her doom to endure, she felt at moments as if she must needs shriek out with the full power of her lungs, and cast herself from the scaffold down upon the ground, or else go mad at once. So she feels pretty desperate, right, in this part, that it is almost intolerable, right? She's bearing it just barely. Yet there were intervals when the whole scene, in which she was the most conspicuous object, so she's the most noticeable, right? We can obviously tell that she's there, seemed to vanish from her eyes, or at least glimmered indistinctly before them, like a mass of imperfectly shaped and spectral images. So we see a simile there. Her mind, and especially her memory, was preternaturally active and kept bringing up other scenes than this roughly hewn street of a little town on the edge of the western wilderness. So she's having a memory. So one thing that's helping to sustain her, we believe, might be her memory, that she's thinking of other things as a coping mechanism. Other faces then were lowering upon her from beneath the brims of those steeple-crowned hats. Reminiscences, the most trifling and immaterial. So she's reminiscing, thinking about the past Passages of infancy and school days, sports, childish quarrels, and the little domestic traits of her maiden years came swarming back upon her, intermingled with recollections of whatever was gravest in her subsequent life, one picture precisely as vivid as another, as if all... Okay, so we're seeing here reminiscences would be like remembering of the past, and this is what she's remembering, right? So here is the different type of memories. So I'm just writing memory types. And so she's thinking about her own childhood, her own school days, the things that she used to do, and then even carrying into her early adulthood when she was still single. And so she's thinking about that. And then it says was gravest in her subsequent life. So now we're talking about the life that follows, which will continue on the next page. Were of similar importance, or all alike a play. Possibly it was an instinctive device of her spirit to relieve itself. So we just talked about that, this idea that she does this to cope, to survive, to get through it, by the exhibition of these phantasmagoric forms from the cruel weight and hardness of the reality. Okay, so here we again have some difficult diction showing it's a scene that's constantly changing, going into different changing forms. Be that as it might, the scaffold of the pillory was a point of view that revealed to Hester Prynne the entire track along which she had been treading since her happy infancy. So she's kind of seeing her life again, right, replaying it. Standing on that miserable, again, diction, right, miserable eminence, she saw again her native village in Old England and her paternal home, a decayed house of gray stone with a poverty-stricken aspect, but retaining a half-obliterated shield of arms over the portal. So a half-obliterated shield of arms shows, like, from her family, right, their coat of arms. In token of antique gentility, she saw her father's face with its bald brow and reverend white beard that flowed over the old-fashioned Elizabethan ruff. Her mother's, too, with the look of heedful and anxious love which it always wore in her remembrance, and which face, glowing with girlish beauty and illuminating all the interior even since her death, had so often laid the impediment of a gentle remonstrance in her daughter's pathway. Okay, so here they're talking, about her paternal home. So paternal is meaning like talking about her father, so where she grew up. And we see here that they were poor, but they used to maybe not be, right? Because of what we mentioned before with the coat of arms, which is like an aristocratic family or a family of nobility would have a coat of arms showing what their family, their name in symbol form. So it's interesting that they must have done poorly along more recent years, but in the past must have had a different lineage. So we see here DC of her parents, right? So I'm going to just write DC of H's parents. Again, make sure you can read that. And so we also see old-fashioned Elizabethan, so that's referring to Queen Elizabeth, and that's an allusion there. And we find out about her parents a bit, right? Anxious love, what her mother looks like. And then we also have some vocabulary here, impediment, remonstrance, making sure that we're okay with the denotation of the difficult language. She saw her own of the dusky mirror in which she had been wont to gaze at it. There she beheld another countenance, of a man well stricken in years, a pale, thin, scholar-like visage, with eyes dim and bleared by the lamplight that had served them to pore over many ponderous books. Remember, this was a word choice from the first chapter that means very heavy. So now there's been a shift here. Shift here goes from memories of her parents, and then it moves into now she sees someone who looks like a scholar. He's pale and thin. So based on the fact that we, again, already know the plot of the book because of our activity we did in the first week back, this is going to be chilling So I'm going to write chill here. So we're going to see that this is Chillingworth. Yet those same bleared optics had a strange penetrating power when it was their owner's purpose to read the human soul. So again, looking at having glasses, this figure of the study and the cloister, as Hester Prynne's womanly fancy failed not to recall, was slightly deformed. So he's slightly deformed, with the left shoulder a trifle higher than the right. So he's a little bit kind of crooked. Next rose before her in memory's picture gallery the intricate and narrow thoroughfares, the tall gray houses, the huge cathedrals, and the public edifices, ancient in date and quaint in architecture, of a continental city, where a new life had awaited her, still in connection with the misshapen scholars. This is, of course, referring to her coming to the New World, and she was supposed to, remember, come with him. So this is coming to, right, Massachusetts colony. But she doesn't come with her husband, as we know. A new life, but feeding itself on time-worn materials, like a tuft of green moss on a crumbling wall. So that's a simile. Lastly, in lieu of these shifting scenes, came back the rude marketplace of the Puritan settlement, with all the townspeople assembled and leveling their stern regards at Hester Prynne. So now she's back in reality. So the memories shift. So we have shift of memory from her previous life, her parents, her husband, Chillingworth, and then now she's back to current times. And so now she's back in the marketplace. Notice again the rude marketplace, and everyone's staring at her. At Hester Prynne, yes, at herself, who stood on the scaffold of the pillory, an infant on her arm, and the letter A in scarlet, fantastically embroidered with gold thread upon her bosom, right? Exclamation point. So again, it's going to be important that it's red. And we'll see later, remember how Pearl is the kind of living embodiment of the A, and Hester makes Pearl look sometimes dressed right like the A. Could it be true? She clutched the child so fiercely to her breast that it sent forth a cry. She turned her eyes downward at the scarlet letter and even touched it with her finger to assure herself that the infant and the shame were real. Yes, these were her realities. All else had vanished. So we see here, this is a rhetorical question. We don't expect a direct answer. And then she kind of freaks out, right? So, Hester kind of freaks out because we see here that she's holding Pearl very tightly against her chest and against the scarlet letter, so much so that Pearl has a little cry out. And so this, again, is showing you this is a terrifying scene for Hester. And she survives it and gets through it, but of course will impact who she is. And, moving forward, it's an important scene that we witness as a reader to what's going on with Hester internally, as the narrative begins.